Nakajima is one of the most renowned feminist attorneys in Japan, specializing in labor law. She led a number of cases on discrimination against women and won many of them, including the very first Supreme Court decision in Japan on gender discrimination, in which declared the discrepancy of mandatory retirement ages for men and women as illegal. She has also been dealing with many divorce cases. She has a long history as a feminist and peace activist. She engaged with the movement against the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty of 1960, acted in support of the Zen-Kyoto, the All-Campus Joint Struggle Committee, the radical student movement of the late 60s, and was involved in the women's liberation movement in the early 70s. In 1975, she formed a renowned Tokyo-based feminist group called International Women's Year Action Group with other feminists. Among many significant achievements of the group, the most notable one is its protest in 1975 against an instant noodle TV commercial depicting a female as a person who cooks and a male as a person who eats. The commercial ended up being canceled. She has also been involved with activism to create new laws, such as the Gender Equal Employment Law. It resulted in the 1985 Equal Employment Opportunity Law. She also established a new group, the Japanese Women's Caucus Against War, in 1980, and has been active in the peace movement until now. So please join me in welcoming Nakajima.
I just learned. Okay, today is the 60th anniversary of the Japanese Constitution, and now in many areas of Japan, well, there is a little bit of time difference between Japan and the United States, but today there are lots of gatherings on commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Japanese Constitution, and so there are many lectures, demonstrations, all like throughout Japan. And I'm really happy to talk about the Japanese Constitution and also about this court case, the trial on the Iraq War. I think especially today.
宣伝しています。
On behalf of the preservation of Article 9 of the Constitution, belong to groups called Article 9 associations. And in fact, the start of the movement to safeguard Article 9 in Japan, and in fact to spread it around the world, comes from an American, Professor Overby, Thomas Overby, I think, who 10 years ago started campaigning to get Article 9 known and spread around the world. And in fact, also our own president of the University of Chicago, just adding on, he who lent the campus and its facilities for the Manhattan Project to defend the atomic bomb was also a great admirer of Article 9, as I learned when the then head of the Socialist Party in Japan, no longer existing, visited. This is about 12 years, that was a footnote, 12 years ago.
それで日本の憲法特に9条は、アメリカの占領軍 GHQ に押し付けられたから変えようという動きが今、盛んになっています、政府の指導者たちによって。
It is said that Article 9, many critics of Article 9, of continuing to safeguard Article 9 in Japan, say that this is part of a constitution that was imposed on Japan by the U.S. occupation at the end of World War II.
しかし、この憲法は、特に9条は、押し付けられたのではなく、確かに草案を作る役割を GHQ はやりましたけれども、日本からも提案されました。そして日本国民の大多数の日本国民がそれに賛成して受け入れました。
That in fact, certainly the occupation side produced its own draft of the Constitution, but there were also drafts produced from the Japan side. And once the Constitution was promulgated, the great majority of the Japanese citizenry were in support of it.
それなのに、この憲法9条を変えろと言っているのが誰ですか？アメリカ政府ですよ。
And then those who are insisting, exerting pressure on Japan to repeal Article 9 is the U.S. government.
ところで、私は戦争体験をした最後の世代、1935年に生まれて、最後の戦争体験世代ですが、私の戦争体験は上と、それから空襲の恐怖からの解放でした。
So I belong to the last generation to have experienced the war in Japan, born in 1935. And my own war experience consists of hunger, acute hunger, and the fear of aerial bombing. And at the end of the war, Japan's defeat in war meant for me liberation from those fears.
ですから日本国憲法ができた時は本当に嬉しかった。もう大歓迎でした。空襲もないし、平和、これから日本は絶対戦争をしないんだ、武器は全部捨てちゃうんだという憲法です。それから男女平等の憲法、これもアメリカ人の、ベアテ・ゴードン・白田ゴードンさんが、元を作ってくれました。22歳のアメリカ人女性です。
So I greeted the Constitution with great joy. It meant that we no longer had to live in fear of war, that we could also imagine a future that was going to be free of war. And moreover, it was also thrilling to think of a constitution that guaranteed gender equality. This is a clause that should especially be attributed to the 22-year-old American woman, Beata Sirota Borden, who held very firm on having this clause put into the Constitution.
それ以来、私はずっと、高校生になってからも大学生になってからもその後、弁護士になってからも平和 を守るということと、男女平等、女性差別をなくす、女性を解放する、そのための運動に、何十年、60年以上力を尽くしてきました。
So from high school through college and then my career as a lawyer, I have dedicated my energy to safeguarding peace according to the Constitution and defending gender equality and the rights of women.
それでいろんな運動をやってきたんですが、その中で憲法を守る運動も一生懸命やってきました。しかしどんどん後退して、これもアメリカの意思で、どんどん後退して、朝鮮戦争になってから日本が、再分離をして自衛隊を発足させて、それで今や自衛隊がこんな世界第2位の、力を持つ軍隊に成長させられてしまいました。
So I've been involved in many movements. I've been especially involved in the movement to safeguard, to preserve the Constitution in Article 9, but things have steadily deteriorated. Again, largely to pressure from the United States. That with the outbreak of the Korean War, we were made to form a police force that then turned into a self-defense force, and this so-called self-defense force has now become the second largest military power in the world. Again, all at the behest of the United States.
その中で今日のテーマである、自衛隊イラク派兵差し止め請求という裁判を、15人の女性が原告になって、裁判所に訴えました。提訴しました。
And so our topic for today has to do with a 15-woman lawsuit that took the government of Japan to court for sending the self-defense forces to Iraq.
2004年提訴はね、2004年8月6日、広島に原爆が落とされた日に提訴しました。
The day we entered the court was entered the case. The lawsuit was August 6th, 2004. It is the anniversary of the day that the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
それでなぜこの裁判を私がやるようになったかと言いますと、実はこれは、先月こちらに、いらした今井紀明君の影響です。
The reason that I became involved in this lawsuit, why I decided to take it on, has to do with the young man who visited the University of Chicago last month, Imai Noriaki. Many of you know him as Nori.
で彼がバグダッドで、監禁人質でいいよね、はい、人質になったことが分かってから、私たちは毎日首相官邸に行って、自衛隊を撤退させようっていうデモをやりました。デモとそれから座り込みを毎日やりました。私も毎日行きました。
When he and the two other young hostages were taken in Iraq in April of 2004, that's 1 year into victory, with the demand of the self-defense forces in exchange for their lives, we, myself included, went every single day to demonstrate in front of the Prime Minister's residence and also to sit in to demand the withdrawal of the self-defense forces.
そこで私が一番感じたことは、彼は18歳の今井君はイラクまで出かけていったんだという衝撃です。私は今さっきお話ししましたように、 憲法を守る、憲法9条を守るということで何十年も、運動をしてきました。ところが現実にはどんどん、自衛隊が大きくなって、憲法の理想と、現実がどんどんかけ離れてきましたね。でその中で私は自分としては一国社会主義って社会主義じゃない、ごめんなさい、一国平和主義ではないつもりだったけれども、今井君を見てですね、若い人はどんどんもう国境を越えて外に出ていって、戦場にも出ていって、それで、そこの、被害を受けている人たちの救援のために活動したわけです。若い日本の若者たちはそれを見て、ああ私は一国平和主義じゃないつもりだったけれども、やっぱり日本の中だけで、平和憲法9条を守れというだけではダメなんだとその時思いました。
What I kept thinking as I demonstrated and sat in front of the Prime Minister's residence along with others was that Imai Noriaki at age 18 had actually gone all the way to Iraq. And I myself had thought that I wasn't a believer in pacifism in one state. She tellingly said initially socialism in one state, but she said pacifism. I didn't think of myself as a believer in pacifism in one state. But I realized that all the years, all the decades that I had been dedicating myself to the peace movement and to the protection of Article 9 in Japan, the reality had only gotten worse, and that the gap between the principle articulated in the law, in the Constitution in Article 9, and reality had only expanded. And in the meanwhile, here were young people from Japan going to Iraq, to the battlefields of Iraq, to try to confirm with their own eyes what they were going on. They had crossed national borders and gone. And I realized then that maybe I myself, in fact, had fallen into working for pacifism in one state.
それで私も、日本の中だけで、平和と言っててはダメなんだと、もっと実際に戦争の被害が起きているところとつながって、そこでの今の戦争を過去の戦争の、思い出だけじゃなくて現在の戦争とつながらなければいけない、それをやめさせるために行動しなければいけないと思いました。
And so what I thought then was that it wasn't enough for me to be working on behalf of peace through my memories of wars of the past, that we had to start up an action that was connected with wars going on in the present moment, and to work to stop those wars today.
それでこの裁判を起こしたわけです。はい、それでなぜ女性15人かというと、女性15人にあと2人の、弁護士がつきました。だから17人で、実際にこの裁判をやりました。でなぜ、女性が集まってやったのかということについて少しお話しします。
And that's why I became involved in this lawsuit of 15 women. In fact, there were 15 women and 2 lawyers. I was one of the 2, so 17 women embarked on this lawsuit in Tokyo District Court. And I want to explain why then these women got together.
それは私が何人か親しい、女友達と集まった時にイラクのため戦争のために何かしなきゃいけないね、何かしたいねというところで一致しました。その女性たち数人とそれでじゃあ今ちょうどその時にすでに裁判があちこちで起こされていました。日本の各地で、それで東京でも起こされていました。それでじゃあ私たちはちょっと友達に呼びかけて、何人か集まって一緒に裁判を起こ 舗装料という話になりました。
I was talking with a few of my women friends, and we said, we found ourselves saying to each other and agreeing that there's something, we really want to do something about the war in Iraq right now. And having agreed that we wanted to start up some action, we decided to call on, each of us to call on others of our friends.
それでたちまち15人が集まりました。で、私もやりたい、私もやりたいということで、15人が集まったわけです。それで、その人たちは、1924年生まれから1969年生まれの人、15人です。それで、弁護士は私が1935年生まれ、もう一人の大脇雅子さんは元参議院議員ですけれども、1934年生まれです。大体その同じような年代ですけれど、もっと上の人からもっと若い人が15人集まりました。
And immediately we came up with 15 women. They range in age from those who were born, one woman born in 1924 to the youngest born in 1969. Of the attorneys, as I mentioned, I was born in 1935, and the other woman who was a member of the House of Councillors in the Parliament was born in 1934.
それでこの彼女たち15人はどういう人たちかっていうと、戦争中教師として、女学生を、学徒動員に引率した人が一番年上です。1924年生まれ。それから東京大空襲のにあった人、友人が死んだ人、東京大空襲ってものすごい大変だったんですよ。私は近くで見て直接は被害に遭わなかったけれども、一夜にして10万人死にました。これは国際法違反ですよね。原爆、広島、長崎も国際法違反だと思いますが、東京大空襲も軍需工場も飛行場も何にもない民家だけのところを焼夷弾をどんどん何千発落として、それで全部焼き尽くした。で、一夜にして10万人死にました。それを体験した人も原告になってます。
Amongst the plaintiffs, the most senior person, the one born in 1924, was a teacher during the war and therefore organized in her girls' higher school to mobilize her students and send them to participate in the war effort. There were others of us who had experienced the great air raid on Tokyo, which was on March 10th, in which 100,000 people were killed overnight. This is a case of incendiary bombing on over an area where there were no military bases, no airports, just civilian homes, then made of paper and wood. And so as you can imagine, if you drop thousands of firebombs on a city like that, then the city is turned immediately into a sea of flames. So 100,000 people killed overnight. She says, I think there's nothing to call this but a violation of international law, as is the case, she believes, with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
で、東京だけでなく、大阪、第二の都市、大阪も大空襲で2回やられました。で、その中で、一人の原告は、布団を水につけて、かぶって逃げて助かった。そういう人がいます。それ、わかりますか?
So that, and then others, there were other air raids over Japan cities. The second city, Osaka, received an attack, a major attack twice. One of the other plaintiffs is a woman who soaked bedding in water and fled or ran around under the fire bombings.
それから、時間がないからもう省略しますけれども、 しい憲法の話っていう教科書が出たんですけれど、これですけどね、でこれで学んだ人が一番多いです。私がそうです。1935年生まれの人が中学1年生の時に、この教科書「新しい憲法の話」っていう教科書で学びました。それからその1935年生まれが私を入れて3人、あと大垣さんは1934年生まれ、それからもう、その辺の人たちが割と多いです。それからあとは、アジアに対する侵略と被害、それをごめんなさい、アジアへの侵略を謝罪して和解するための活動をやってきた人もいます。この人は元参議院議員です。
There's a core of us who studied with this textbook called The Story of the New Constitution. I'm sorry we can't show an expanded way, but this is the kind of illustration to be found in this textbook where there's a huge melting pot and all kinds of weaponry and tanks are thrown into the melting pot at the top and come out in the bottom as homes, trains, fire trucks, in other words, to show graphically what can be done if you throw away your weapons and use those monies for other purposes. So there were those of us who studied social studies from this legendary textbook, and others who participated in the movement to apologize to Asian neighbors for our acts of aggression in World War II and to seek reconciliation with other Asian countries.
それからいわゆる従軍慰安問題、制度冷静、その問題に取り組んでいる人が2人原告になってます。
And two others of the plaintiffs were women who have been working on the former military comfort limit, that is to say, the Japanese system of military settler slavery.
それから DV の被害に取り組んDV 被害者の救援に取り組んでいる人も原告です。
Other plaintiffs who've been working on domestic violence.
それから教育問題、今日本の教育はどんどん、戦前に戻っています。その教育問題に取り組んでいる人もいます。
Others who are dealing with education problems because the Japanese educational system is rapidly returning to its pre-war principles.
それから夫の転勤で、WTO ですよね。WTO のすぐそばに住んでいて、9.11 の被害に遭った人も一人います。
And the youngest of the plaintiffs is a woman who happened to be living quite near the World Trade Center at the time of 9/11 because her husband had been, because of her husband's job.
で、彼女は、ピースフルトモローズ、ピースフルトモローズの要するに被害者の遺族の人たちの集まりで、私の家族の名前で戦争をしないでと訴えた人たち、ご存知ですか？
Do any of you know about Peaceful Tomorrows, the 9/11 families who gathered together to say, not in our name, don't engage in wars of revenge in the name of our loved ones who were lost?
その人たちの運動に非常に自分もショックを受けたけど、その人たちの運動に非常に共感した人です。若い人、一番若い人です。
So this youngest of the plaintiffs was of course shocked and hurt herself, traumatized herself, but she felt great identification with the Peaceful Tomorrows movement of the Not in Our Name.
その人たちの最終陳述というのをここにまとめてあるんですけど、これは皆さんにないんですね。
Some of you may持っていらっしゃる方もいるけれど、
はい、そこでちょっと一部だけ紹介させてください。 女性差別の職場の女性差別で裁判をやっている人です。はい、でその人は1932年生まれで、彼女が書いていることは、13歳で、原爆で13歳の子供少女が死んだっていうことを後で知った。それだけではなく、その時私は何をしていたかと考えると胸が痛みます。可愛いです。次から知らなかった衝撃、知らされなかった衝撃、沖縄のことも内勤虐殺も731部隊のことも従軍慰安婦のこともずっと後になって知った。戦争とはこのように精神を知ることも束縛するものなのですということを言ってます。今皆さんのこういうことって自分のこととして考えられますか？みんな知ってますか？イラクでどんなことが起きているか。イラクで米軍が何をしているか、どんなことが起きているか知らない。最近少しずつ知ったけれども、戦争が起きた時はあんまり知らなかったでしょ。戦争ってみんな知らされないんですよね。後から、もうずっと後になってから知らされる。それがとても恐ろしいことだという意見陳述をしました。これは今でも言えることなんじゃないでしょうか。
So one of the plaintiffs born in 1932 is a woman engaged in a legal battle with her company, the company where she's employed, for gender discrimination. But she writes about having been 13 at the time Hiroshima was bombed, and thinking about other children born in that year who were killed. And she said that she's reflecting on that in her statement to the court on the last day of the hearing. She says, "I didn't know until long after the end of the war. When I think about what it was I was doing at the time, my heart aches. The shock of not having known, the shock of not having been informed." This was the case with Okinawa, the Battle of Okinawa, the Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, and the Comfort Women. I learned about all these things much, much later. War is also about this kind of restriction on people's psyches and on what they know. And I feel that this is something that can be said today too. I'm wondering how much you know about what is going on in Iraq today. Perhaps you know quite a bit more than when the war first began in 2003. But that is the way war always is. It begins and you don't, and the people don't know what is going on at the beginning. And it's only retroactively that they come to know what was going on.
それから本当は女性と平和運動の話をしたい、フェミニズムにとって重要な問題なんですが、後の質問のところで質問があったらお答えするということでいいですか？ということでちょっと言って。
I want to talk about the issue of women and war and the relationship between feminism and war, but I'd like to, if it's all right, I would like to hold that off for the question and answer or a discussion session. If there are questions, it's something I would like to address in response.
それで私たちが裁判を起こしてイラクで一体何が起きているか、日本の自衛隊は憲法を持っているにもかかわらず日本の自衛隊が重武装してそれでイラクに出かけて、米軍を支援している。今も支援しています。陸上自衛隊は引き上げたけれども航空自衛隊は、米兵とそれから軍事物資弾薬を運んでいます。ほとんど、8割はその仕事をやる、航空自衛隊です。日本の。
So, in launching this lawsuit, we were questioning what the self-defense force was doing in Iraq, in spite of the fact that we have this constitution, in spite of the fact that Article 9 still stands. the ground and the self-defense force continues to fill this role of assisting the United States troops in Iraq. The ground self-defense forces have been withdrawn, but the air self-defense forces are still there, transporting U.S. troops and explosives. So 80% of that is what they are doing currently.
そこで一体何が起きているかということについて、写真とか手記とかいろんな証拠を出して、訴えました。ダメだった。その血まみれの少女の、写真を掲げて、私は裁判官にこの血まみれの少女の写真を見てください、じっと見つめてくださいと言って裁判所で法廷で訴えました。日本の裁判所ではそういうことあんまりやらないんですよ。アメリカでは割とやるでしょ、少しこうパフォーマンス的なことでも日本ではね、もっと事務的なんだけど、ちょっとパフォーマンスをやりました。
So unfortunately, I can't show you the image right now, but we submitted as evidence many images and writings to have the justices confront evidence of what is going on the ground in Iraq today. And I stood in front of the bench with this photograph from the cover of Days Japan, which is now an internationally awarded photo journal, of a very bloody young girl being carried by men. And she stood in front of the three judges and said, "Take your time, please take your time and look at this picture of this bleeding girl." This is something we don't do very much in the courtroom in Japan. I know that you're much more dramatic or performative in U.S. courts, but in Japan we tend to be much more businesslike. But I really wanted the judges to be confronted with this photograph.
それで私たちは、裁判所に何を求めたかというと、もうすぐ何を求めたかというと、自衛隊をイラクに武装して派遣するのは憲法違反である。これはもう明らかな憲法違反です。それがまず第一ですが、日本の裁判所はただこの法律が憲法違反であるということだけでは判断をしません。具体的に誰がどんな被害を受けたか、直接被害を受けた人が訴えたらその被害に対して、判決を下す、損害賠償をせよとかいうそういうシステムになってます。アメリカもそうですよね。
So what were we seeking in this lawsuit? First of all, we wanted the court to recognize what was unambiguously a violation of the Constitution to send the armed self-defense forces to a war zone. But that is not sufficient in Japan because there's no constitutional court, which is something that can be addressed later in Japan. So even if there's a violation of the Constitution, in order to bring a case to court, you have to be a person who can show concrete injury as a consequence of the state's action. This is similar to U.S. laws. It's called standing.
それで私たちがどんな権利を侵されたかということで主張したのは平和的生存権というものです。日本国憲法の全文に書いてあるものです。
So what were we going to assert as rights that had been violated? The first is the right to a peaceful, to live in peace, which is clearly stipulated in the preamble to the Constitution.
でその内容は殺されない、それから殺さない権利、殺されたり殺すことを強制されたりしない権利というものです。それは皆さんあんまりアメリカではそういう議論はないですよね。平和的生存権というものは日本の憲法にしかないですから、それが変えられようとしていますが今。
The right to live in peace is uniquely stipulated in the Constitution of Japan. And the heart of that right is the right not to be compelled, to be free of compulsion to kill or be killed. Right? It's not just not to be exposed to the risk of being killed, but not to be compelled to kill others. And I'm wondering if that's a kind of argument that takes place in the United States. In Japan, it's the Constitution that gives a basis for such argument.
で特に日本で私たちは、テロの危険っていうことも一応言いましたけれども、テロの危険よりかイラクで日本の自衛隊が米軍を支援してイラクの人たちを殺すことが、実際に殺さないで済んだから殺すことを支援したわけですよね。明らかに支援しました。でそれがもう私たちにとっては苦しい、辛い、もうこの苦痛には耐えられない。だからこの苦痛を、与えた自衛隊派兵は、私たちの平和的生存権を侵すというそういう主張です。
And so, of course, we included the danger of terrorism, the desire not to be exposed to the risk of a terrorist attack. But what was really fundamental to us was the knowledge that self-defense forces of Japan were in Iraq assisting U.S. troops. The self-defense forces themselves ended up not having to directly kill the Iraqi people. But we were certainly aware that the self-defense forces were assisting U.S. troops in killing the Iraqi people. The knowledge that that was happening to us constituted extraordinary pain and suffering.
でその苦痛を感じるもの、何によって感じるか実感するかというと、3つ挙げて終わりにします。はい、1番目は過去の私たちの戦争体験と、それから追体験、親から聞いた話とか、だから若い人たちも親とかおじいさんおばあさんから聞いてます。だから過去の戦争体験と追体験が一つ、全部一応、はい、2番目が従軍慰安婦とされた女性たちの問題が90年代に明るみに出ました。私たちが詳しく知るようになりました。それに対して私たちがこんな加害責任を負ってたんだ、それに対して戦後扶助をしてない、戦後責任をしてな果たしてないということについての苦痛、それから現在のイラクで行われている、殺し合いの実態を、見つめることによって感じる苦痛、この苦痛を、これを権利としてね、苦痛を与えられない権利ということで主張しました。それでその点は皆さんはどうですか。皆さんは直接、身近な人たちや皆さんが戦場にイラクに行くことはないと伺っていますけれども、でもアメリカの人たちがたくさんイラクに行って3300人を出たんですか、今死者が出て、怪我人はもっともっとたくさんいます。そういう、アメリカの人たち、そしてそれを超えるもう10万人、5万人とか10万人と言われるイラクの人たちが悲惨な状態で殺されたり、怪我を受けたり、拷問を受けたりしていますよね。そういうことについて想像力を持って、それでその苦痛を自分の感じる感性、その感性があるかないかということを問われているのではないかと思います。私たちはそれを苦痛に感じて裁判を起こしました。結論として、裁判では敗訴しましたけれども、そのことを私たちは、訴えてみんな周りにも広げていきました。そのことに意義があったと思います。今まだ続いている、 この悲惨なことを、受け止められる感性をみんなが持ちたいなと思っております。以上です。
Okay, so the three factors that are important here. One is that what is the source of this pain that experience, the injury we feel in having this self-defense forces of Japan participating in this war. The first is the war experience that either we are old enough to have experienced and remember ourselves, or that we heard about from our mothers and grandmothers. That's one thing. The second is the disclosure, the widespread awareness, this was certainly at the first time it was disclosed, in the early 1990s, of the military comfort women, the sex slaves, to realize that this had gone on in World War II, that this was part of our responsibility as perpetrators, and that we had failed to make compensation for these crimes. And thirdly is to be witness, to be aware of the killing that is ongoing in Iraq right now. That it's now over 3,300 US troops have been killed, many, many more injured. As for numbers of Iraqis killed and subjected to unspeakable suffering and torture, some say 50,000 or 100,000, it's very hard to pin a precise number on it. But it is an actual ongoing source of pain for us to imagine this suffering going on amongst all the parties involved in this war. And we lost this battle. Our lawsuit was rejected. Our claims were rejected. But we still feel that there was a point, it was meaningful to have made our case in this way. We continue to believe in the things that we asserted in court and continue to be active. There are, by the way, other lawsuits of this kind still going on in Japan. They're not all finished. And what I want to affirm here, I want to emphasize here, is the sensibility of being able to share the pain that is not immediate to us. And that is a question I would like to pose to you too. I understand that most of you who are in here at the University of Chicago are little likely to find yourselves as soldiers in Iraq. Put that aside. Is there a sensibility, is there a sensibility developing here that is able to imagine the suffering that is going on physically far from here? That is a sensibility that we plaintiffs had developed through the experiences, the 3 points that I enumerated right now. And that's the question I want to end my part of the presentation with.
Well, I come to this discussion not as an expert in Japan, exactly the opposite. I have virtually no knowledge at all. But I've really been quite as moved by a paper as by this one. It's an extraordinary piece of work, not merely because it's exquisitely imagined and exquisitely conceived, but because it spells out in very dramatic terms, both from a scholarly perspective, but even more so from a human perspective, what precisely the costs of American empire are. Rarely do we, in fact, even begin to think of the questions of the effect of the Iraq War, and indeed of the illegal actions of the Bush administration over the last 5-6 years on the countries of the world and their interiors. I'm an Africanist. I live in South Africa. Our economy has been as deeply damaged by this Iraq war as the psyches of many peoples across the planet. I think the answer to the question, can we imagine the pain in Iraq sitting in the comforts of Chicago? The answer is emphatically no. I don't think we can begin to. I think that our regime has engaged in a form of psychic warfare that would do Frans Fanon proud in colonizing our consciousnesses by absence, by not showing us the cost, by not showing us bodies, by telling us that Iraqi bodies don't even count, let alone are properly part of our experience. This paper raises a number of scholarly questions, a number of human questions. A couple of scholarly questions I think are important because they mark real shifts in the empire of politics and the politics of empire. And I use that juxtaposition very pointedly. It's clear from the story that we've heard that our game of empire is damaging the Japanese constitution in its living form, just as it is damaging the constitutions of many nations caught up in this war. We've long lost the separation between church and state because, in fact, its juxtaposition has been forced upon us worldwide. We're fighting, after all, a almost Huntingtonian evangelical crusade, sometimes in the name of capital and sometimes in the name of the church. And the obscenity of the relationship between the two is startling. The Japanese constitution isn't the only constitution that is being damaged as we speak. I think the English legal system is being damaged as we speak. I think the French national election right now is being damaged as we speak. I think that the xenophobias that are expressed around the world right now are being exacerbated as we speak. And in all of these places are things being done in the name of the law in order to make it okay. We live in the age of lawfare, where the law is mobilized in order to conduct and to condone and to create and to perpetrate violence, even when we don't see its effects. This paper raises lots of questions in that respect. Why is it right now that we're seeing the world redefine politics through the law courts? Why are we seeing politics being judicialized as they are? Why are we seeing forms of constitutional law being evoked in order to imagine both the making and the unmaking of nations? But I'd like to ask or start this conversation by making a point that actually almost slid by in its power in the paper. We have an extraordinary account of the basis of the suit in a doubling. On the one hand, in psychic and emotional damage. And I think very rarely have I seen such a persuasive account made between historical experience and the experience of the present. Those of us who grew up in anti-fascist struggles, as I did, I lost my citizenship to an anti-fascist struggle, know precisely how memory really plays into the present of pain. The basis of this lawsuit is partly about psychic and emotional damage, partly about historical consciousness come back to haunt one psychic and indeed the collective psychic well-being of the nation. Its other part is security risk. Of course, a language which we've all had to live with in its banalized forms. But somewhere along the way, one of the witnesses says, what this war also evokes is domestic violence. And this to me is a very powerful invocation, because warfare often obscures and opens up at the same time the cracks and the fissures of the face of civil society. And why it is that one of the litigants, one of the members of this class action, should see a parallel, an analogy between domestic violence on the one hand and global violence on the other hand is a very powerful question. It's a powerful question precisely because constitutions often protect us from what we don't need protecting, and often fail to protect us from what we do need protecting. And of course, the failure is always the banishment of violence. And the parallel between privatized violence and global imperial violence is often much closer than we think. The character of the US war in Iraq, after all, will leave many more families damaged than it will Iraqi soldiers killed. It will leave many more local economies devastated for a generation than it will leave men in uniforms who after all commit themselves to warfare incarcerated. And it is that, the power to force those kinds of juxtapositions that I think the story tells us powerfully. It seems to me that the three questions that this paper raises very powerfully, at least for me as a non-specialist, is why did the suit actually fail? It was, after all, from the perspective of a comparative legal scholar, an extremely powerful one. It was very powerfully argued. The quality of the litigation, if this were in any international court, was about as good as it gets. I've heard many less convincing arguments win cases like this in constitutional courts across the country. This one lost. The question then becomes, what is it that caused the loss? It's not law. It's not the capacity of the plaintiffs and their legal representatives to make a good case. Something intervenes, in other words, between justice and judgment. And the question in this case is, what intervenes between justice and judgment? And this is a question that we in the US ought to be asking ourselves, because we're going to have similar kinds of lawsuits, not under constitutional law, but under various other kinds of property law, tort law, in years to come. And the same kinds of issues are going to arise. What cases become winnable against the imperial tendencies of an illegal administration? And where and how does justice lose out to judgment? That's the first question. The second question is that this was a case brought by 15 women. There's a truism now in anthropological theory which says, you know, once upon a time we worried about social class, now we worry about class actions. This shift from class to class action is very striking in this instance because it was conducted by 15 women. To what extent was this a nation reflecting on itself through the optic of gender? And what is at stake in doing that? Now, this is a question that's very powerfully posed, again, comparatively. After all, some of the most powerful arguments that are being fought now against xenophobia, against all kinds of injustice across the planet, are increasingly becoming women's movements. What does that tell us about the nature of politics? Is politics migrating also into the domain of gender and of generation, away from the things that used to be located in, like class, like inequality, like strangeness as well? So the second question that this raises is, what does this tell us more about the relationship between gender and the political across the planet? The third question that it raises for me is the following. What is especially powerful about this case is that it defines a class of human actor through suffering and victimage. How general a phenomenon this is. How is this? How more and more are we coming to know identity itself through suffering, through victimage, through trauma, through hurt? This is an argument that Wendy Brown makes in her book States of Injury. And it's a very powerful argument. More and more are we knowing ourselves, not through the positive, not through claims to culture, through claims to positive value in the world, but to trauma and to industry. Trauma and injury. Does this mean that we are caught up in a political age in which, in effect, mobilization is predicated purely on the negation of our humanity? And if that's the case, what does it tell us about the world we live in at the contemporary moment? How can we envisage reversing that process and making a positive politics that actually impacts upon the world before the world impacts upon us, before the world makes all of us different versions of those 15 very brave women?
Thank you.